Good evening. I'm going to continue reading from this book, Wise Owl and Barn Owl, a biography written by Angela Canning on the lives of her friends who have now passed on. Louis he had a sex change, but that doesn't matter. And they were already married, I presume. I haven't read all the details of their, but it's about their life and their work. They were pioneers of rescuing and caring for wildlife. It's beautiful. So chapter 3 is in 1964. I'm not sure if I headed each chapter. Chapter 2 was 1964, and chapter 1 doesn't have a year, but it's all around that time. So chapter 3 doesn't have a title, just a year, and that's the year my first daughter was born, Sarah. She was born 24th of January that year, so it's a special year for me too. So I'm going to enjoy reading this. And I used to live in London at the time, so that's even more interesting. So chapter 3, 1965. Spring arrived, the time when nature is alive with productivity, and the time Yvonne declared when her products all find their way to our hospital. Boxes of nestlings and fledglings began arriving, some left in the emergency cages in the garden when we were out. Most of the contents bore no resemblance to their parents at all. Little brown fledglings with spotted breasts and brown beaks were blackbirds. Curious grey fledglings without a hint of speckles were starlings. Tiny speckled brown balls of fluff represented robins, while some were unattractive little bald specimens without a hint of feathers at all. To keep them protected, we put the nestlings in boxes in the warmth of the airing cupboard, well ventilated, and the fledglings in cages in the spare bedroom. It is nature's miracle, the way the mother senses that the climate is right to lay and incubate her eggs, so that her young are hatched at the exact time to feed upon emerging caterpillars, grubs or insects. But the job had now been handed over to us. We had to find a substitute, something as moist as the natural food softened by the parents' saliva. Tiny gaping mouths waited in all directions from 6 in the morning until dusk, the nestlings demanding theirs every 2 hours and the fledglings every 4. But it was an impossible task to find enough insects. We mixed thick crumb with raw egg and in desperation gave them morsels of tinned cat food, but it was not adequate. Only half were surviving, and we were burying sad little corpses. What did the doctor have to say? Asked Yvonne one day, as we wiped our brows, perplexed. The doctor? Who wrote that book that we found in the Charing Cross Road? Oh, I recalled that book that she meant. It was one we had found one day in London, while browsing in the dusty alcoves of the Dickensian bookshops, a small illustrated book, its pages yellowed with age. I searched around and found it. It was entitled British birds, their successful management in captivity with other Allied information for fanciers, published in 1891. Birdcage Walk in London is a living memorial to the poor wild birds snared and caged in those days. Linnet Terrace in Cambridgeshire is yet another, built in 1904, from the proceeds of selling linnets at a penny each. It was quite deplorable, yet the information which Dr. J. Denham Bradburn had collected on the care of them was invaluable. I read the piece about feeding on page 12. Here's something. Mealworms, the larvae of a beetle which thrives in large flour mills. Perhaps the miller could help us. The beetles can be kept in large jars, fed on oat or barley meal, and will lay their eggs on sacking. I stopped. Oh, that's no good. They should not be disturbed for 3 months or so. We need something immediately. I read on. What about gentles, the larva of the blowfly? It seems they can be produced very quickly, although the doctor didn't want anything to do with it. He says, all you need do is hang up an offal and you will soon meet with your reward. Plenty of maggots and plenty of filth and smells. Well, we needn't hang it up. We could bury it, Yvonne ventured. Yes, we could, I agreed, wondering why I hadn't thought of it. Come along then, let's see what Mr. Lydiard on the bridge has to offer. You could try any tripe, he volunteered, pushing his straw boater to the back of his head. Or there's some pig liver about to be thrown out. We'll take it, we said, thanking him. We packed it all in our bag and returned home. We lay it out on the earth, just below the topsoil, covering it speedily. I fancied it was already beginning to smell, which could only have been my imagination in anticipation of the joys to come. Next day we uncovered it. It was seething with white maggots, and we filled a polythene box with the wriggling things. A pair of tweezers made a marvellous substitute for the parent's beak, and the fledgling blackbirds never failed to amuse us. Each one, when about to take a tweezerful or 3 or more, always gave a hearty chirrup. The starlings, the squawkies, however, gaped their mouths wide open as soon as they saw it, but snapped them shut before the food was inside. It was a work of art to get it in, and when in, unless we pushed it to the backs of their throats, it was never swallowed. Usually they would have the tweezers in their beaks, then would shake their heads, and the food would fly everywhere. A syringe did not prove an easy method by which to administer water, so we hit on the idea of giving them the chip crumbs soaked in water on the broad end of a nail file. The tiny pied wagtails and blue tits, each about 2.5 inches long, were a far greater risk, a greater task. They refused to open their beaks, like minute pins, and there was only one way to prise them open gently from the side and force feed them. The maggots had proved to be the answer, but if we did not use them up within a week, they became stiff and still and began pupating. Then every single one of our charges refused point blank to touch them. The answer was to keep them in a ventilated polythene box in the refrigerator. At length, a cheeky starling plus 2 of the blackbirds began to feed themselves from a dish, the food flying everywhere, and it was amusing to watch them. We had had them for 2.5 weeks, and we knew they would show us when they were sufficiently matured to go. Meanwhile, the number of waterfowl in trouble on the river was increasing quite alarmingly. Not only were fishing hooks caught round the heads or legs of swans and ducks, but reports were coming to us of a practice in fashion by young hooligans. They would seize a duck, fasten a rubber band around its bill and the back of its head, preventing the poor creature from opening its mouth, and so it would die of starvation. When a duck was terrorized, it was impossible to catch it on the bank. One day, we had to borrow one of the lockkeeper's boats to row after one and rescue it. It was no easy matter chasing a duck up and down river in an attempt to lasso it with a large fishing net. Ducks are wonderful flyers, and it meant getting John Gould to open the lock gates and swing bridge. Even then the poor thing, flapping its wings desperately, raced away, escaping us. Still, the fledgling season was not over, and we never expected to receive our next patient, a baby kingfisher. He was a source of delight. Even as a fledgling, his colours were beautiful, and his metallic blue-green led us to name him Sapphire. The problem was to find ways of feeding him, and there was nothing for it but to set off armed with a fishing net and a jam jar down to the river. We soon became expert minnowers. After 2 weeks, he began to fly, small distances, and we decided to provide a miniature pond for him in his pen, which we filled with the minnows. Sapphire loved it. We watched him diving from his little bow and catching them himself, first tossing them into the air, then swallowing them head first. When a month had passed by, his wings and tail were mature, and when we discovered his underbeak was turning red, we discovered that Sapphire was a female. Her senses were keen, and we decided, sadly, that we must take the gamble to see if she could cope with the big world outside. We knew a protected tree-lined spot along the bank of the canal at Speen Moors, took her there and set her free. Sapphire perched on a low, overhanging bough of a willow tree, watching the current uncertainly. For what seemed an eternity, she did nothing, and then, eventually, disappeared amongst the foliage. An hour later, we returned to see if she was adapting to her natural habitat, but she had completely gone. For days afterwards, we searched for her again, but Sapphire was enjoying her new life, nowhere to be seen. It was months later, in August, as we were taking a stroll along that part of the canal, that a sudden streak of electric blue skimmed up the river, and we were 90% sure that it was Sapphire. She had shown us that she was a true creature of the wild again, and gave us a sense of reward. We made our way home. How was it, we asked each other, as we walked, that with their tropical colours, kingfishers ever came to be a native of our isles, and left willing to endure with us the ice of winter, freezing to their bow? It was a wonder of nature. The miniature pond that we had provided for Sapphire in her pen proved advantageous. whenever we had tiny orphan ducklings or cygnets to nurse. But the trouble was, we had no large pond for injured waterfowl like swans, Canada geese or ducks. We had thought about making one for some time, and had acquired a strong PVC liner from a garden centre, resistant to claws. Now it required a search through an instructional gardening book to learn the do's and don'ts of pond building. It was midday, and there was a knock at the door. It was interesting to note how we came to know a complete cross-section of the public in our new venture, from the richest to the poorest. Around Newbury are many landed estates, and this time it was Lady Porchester from the Highclere estate, whose father-in-law was the 6th Earl of Carnarvon. She had come to ask for advice. "I've a pet quail," she told us. Quail eggs are a sought-after delicacy for the table. "There is nothing wrong with her wings, but she will not fly." Quails always live and feed on the ground, we explained. They are very secretive creatures, hidden amongst crops on farmlands, and normally only fly when disturbed by sportsmen or predators. They are known as bottom feeders. She laughed at that term. "I see. Thank you so much for your help," and drove off. A week later, she returned with an injured drake. "I spotted this poor thing by our lake. You see it has a broken leg. Could you please look after it?" "Of course," we said. "We'll mend the leg. And would you mind if we release him again on your estate once he's better?" Whenever possible, we like to return our patients to where they were found. "Any time you wish," she replied, and left a donation for his keep. Yvonne took him, naming him Charlie. He was a handsome mallard with a characteristic iridescent green head changing to purple in a different light. As the drakes mature, so their colours become brighter, and Charlie's bill was a vivid yellow, which indicated that he was at least 2 years old, yet his poor orange leg hung limply. "I'll see to him," she said, and disappeared into the kitchen. I remained in the garden to begin making a hole for the pond in the cool of the evening. I dug and I dug and dug, but soon learned that it wasn't easy going. The ground could not have been touched for years, and the soil was rock hard. Charlie's leg was broken in the place most common, I thought, as I worked just below the knee joint, and being a large bird like Barney, it would take 8 to 12 weeks to mend. He seemed quite fearless of humans. Many families on the estate or groundsmen had been used to feeding him. He would enjoy swimming on his pond while recuperating. I continued digging. Yvonne was expert at first aid. I knew she would use lollipop sticks again, invaluable when mending legs of large birds, and this time she would bind them with a roll of 2-inch elastoplast to each of the leg, definitely not to the front and back, so that the poor bird couldn't move, and at least 1/4 of an inch above the foot and 1/4 of an inch below the knee joint. I continued perspiring. Being a waterfowl, of course, she would then take a sheet of waterproof green oilskin from the chemist, the sort Mother used to use over lint to cover our cut knees as children, and cut it into strips to cover her work. Charlie could then swim to his heart's content, all the while that his leg was mending. Phew, what hot work it was! Suddenly, my spade hit against something hard. I dug further and unearthed two objects. Yvonne was still in the kitchen, obviously having taken a liking to Charlie. She was talking to him as I waltzed in, wiping my brow, and asked, "Good heavens, what have you got there?" "Have a guess." She took them from me and scrutinized them, removing the soil. "It can't be. Yes, it's a pair of brass coffin handles." The end of chapter 3. You have to wait now for chapter 4, which is set in 1966, the year I had Marianne, 27th of February. I shan't forget that either. Oh dear, and that birth was in Downer Market, in my mother's home, the chalet, Priory Road. Oh. Well, we'll read some more another time. Thank you so much for listening. I'm enjoying this book. I've got to congratulate Angela. I didn't know she could write like this. Just as she loves Enid Blyton, that's why she can write like this. She's got a collection.